It's only been a couple of weeks since the Flash movie was released, and I think we can call it dead. A moment of silence for the Flash. I am a fan of the Flash, and I wanted the movie to do well. But that's the life of DC fans. We are like the underdog of superhero movies. But why is the Flash movie being called dead? Let's take the numbers very, very seriously. Prior to its release, the most conservative projections for the film said it would open with a box office between $60 and $70 million. However, The Flash only managed to make $55 million. It should be made clear that the predictions that studios regularly release are somewhat low, so that later the headlines say, "The Flash movie exceeded all expectations." To put it in context, Guardians of the Galaxy Vol. 3, another superhero movie with a similar budget, had an expectation of between $110 and $120 million, something it did achieve. And well, maybe it didn't have a good first weekend, but there was hope that the film would be so good that people's recommendations would keep it afloat. Sadly, this was not the case, as The Flash suffered a 79% drop, the biggest in superhero movie history, second only to Morbius. So, well, what's the situation? The Flash had an estimated budget of $220 million, and so far has only been able to recoup $210. And no, it's not even close to breaking, even because you have to add advertising and marketing costs. What number would look good for The Flash's final gross? About $600 million at least, something that already looks impossible today. To put it in context, the Batman grossed $771 million on a budget of $180. But what happened to this movie? What was the big mistake Warner made? And above all, what can it do to avoid falling into the same rut? That's what we're going to talk about today, as we're going to do an autopsy on the Flash movie. To understand how the Flash movie died, first we have to talk about a phenomenon that happens to superhero movies, something I like to call the superfall. What is the superfall in superhero movies? No, I don't mean that cool way of landing. I mean this strange phenomenon where superhero movies suffered a massive drop in box office from the first week of release to the second. For example, The Flash had a 79% drop, Quantumania had a 69% drop, Love and Thunder had a 68% drop, and Multiverse of Madness had a 67% drop. That's something different than what we see in other blockbusters. Mario Bros. Had a 36% drop. Top Gun Maverick dropped 33%, and Avatar only dropped 18%. What does this mean? That we superhero movie fans tend to see movies on the first weekend. We're intense, whereas the general audience takes it more slowly. However, if the movie connects with the audience, it's possible for the overdrop to be much lower, as is the case with Guardians of the Galaxy Vol. 3, which had a 47% overdrop, or Across the Spider-Verse, which had a 54% drop. Understanding this is very important because a superhero movie then depends on its first weekend to recoup much of its investment at the box office, and Flash was far from this. The other option, as I discussed, was that the film would connect with people, and as a result the film would stay afloat, but this didn't happen either. Why? In general, this may be due to the so-called superhero genre fatigue, which refers to this increasingly sounding idea that we have already seen so many similar movies that the audience is getting tired of it. I recently made a video in which I analyzed the box office and critical approval of all the superhero movies of the last 10 years. If you want to know more about, I'll leave the link. But in particular, it may be because this concept of the multiverse, we already see it everywhere at the same time. In superhero movies, we saw this concept in No Way Home, Multiverse of Madness, the What If series, and Across the Spider-Verse. What's worse is that all of these productions came out before The Flash. Curiously, if The Flash had been released on time, it would have been released before all the other movies, since its release date was March 23, 2018. That is, 5 years ago. Not only that, but the first superhero in history to be strongly linked to the concept of the multiverse in the comics was The Flash. In fact, if you ask me, he's the superhero who makes the best use of this concept in his stories. But even though Flash did it first in the comics, to the general public it feels different. It feels like DC is reusing Marvel concepts and not in the best way. Personally, I did enjoy the Flash movie. I think it has beautiful moments, but on the other hand, I totally understand why people are focusing on the bad CGI. I mean, those babies really look like they're going to appear to you in the night. Another very important point is that, surely, Warner Bros. Thought that having multiple Batmans in one movie would have a similar effect to what was experienced with the Spider-Man 3. And this was far from being the case. Why is that? We should start by saying that, in theory, the comparison is valid. Spider-Man is Marvel's most lucrative property, just as Batman is DC's most lucrative. However, the big difference is in the era in which all of these films involved were released. Tobey Maguire was last seen in theaters 15 years ago, Andrew Garfield 9 years ago, while the last time we saw Michael Keaton as Batman was 31 years ago. And that makes all the difference in the world. Think of it this way. If someone was 8 years old when Spider-Man 3 was released, saw Amazing Spider-Man at 15, and got to experience No Way Home at 22, an age that falls within the audience for superhero movies according to a 2021 survey that says the audience for these types of movies is, on average, between 18 and 34 years old. If someone was 8 years old when they saw Batman Returns, they'd be watching The Flash at 39, which is already out of line with the trend. Would The Flash have done better if it had gotten Christian Bale? I genuinely think so. And it's not that they didn't try, since according to Kevin Smith, Warner Bros. Tried many times to convince Christian Bale to return as Batman in the Flash film. But the actor refused, as he has told him many times that the only way for him to return to play Batman is with the blessing of Christopher Nolan. Having said that, I think the plan was to put him in a cameo at the end and that's it. And if this was the case, I don't think it would have been that appealing or drawn that much attention. At least not for people to pay a ticket just for a cameo. I mean, it's one thing to show us 3 Spider-Man collaborating and actively participating in the plot, and it's quite another to put a cameo and that's it. And I say, without spoilers, people who have already seen The Flash will know that it has some impressive cameos, but unfortunately they stay there, in cameos, in brief appearances that are a beautiful fan service, but perhaps do not contribute much to the box office. At least not to the level of seeing 3 Spider-Man collaborating in the plot. Another very important factor in the death of the Flash movie is the fact that our movie-going habits have changed dramatically since the pandemic. Has it ever happened to you that you recommend a movie, and the first thing you're asked is it already on Netflix or one of those services? Doesn't it give you the impression that people are increasingly dismissing movies as their first choice? If you answered yes, it's not just your impression, because according to a statistic from April 22 in the United States, 52% of people decide not to go to the movies, a percentage that before the pandemic was only 15%. So why is this happening? During part of the pandemic, studios like Warner released major movies simultaneously in theaters and on HBO Max. Other companies like Disney, meanwhile, sent many movies directly to streaming or digital purchase. The studio's strategy was to attract audiences to their streaming services. Everyone wanted to be the new Netflix. But it seems that these actions and the fact that for a long time we couldn't go to the theaters made people feel more and more comfortable with watching new movies at home at a fraction of the price. All they had to do was wait a little while. Yes, it's true that going to the movies is an experience that can't quite be emulated at home, but is it really worth paying for this experience for any movie? I think many people are asking this very question. This leaves Flash in a very bad place, as it's neither that far removed from other superhero movies, nor is it visually impressive enough to stand out. In fact, the month of June was a very busy one for blockbusters, as Across the Spider-Verse, Transformers, The Flash, Elemental, and Indiana Jones were all scheduled for release. 5 films with million-dollar budgets that obviously expected big profits, which never came because, remember, people hardly ever go to the movies, much less to see 5 movies in a month. In fact, as of today, of the top 10 highest-grossing films of 2023, 5 are considered economic failures due to their high production costs. And the fact is that big budgets imply that companies expect profits, something that did not happen in most of these cases. Finally, it is one of the most important points. This movie has been caught in the crossfire between Warner Brothers bureaucracy, Ezra Miller scandals, and fan fights. On the one hand, James Gunn has talked a lot about his new DCU and new projects. Unfortunately, this makes movies like The Flash, Shazam 2, Aquaman 2, and maybe even Blue Beetle feel like films that are in a universe that is no longer valid, as if they are mere transitional projects. And this puts a lot of fans off. So what's the point? Not only that, but the Flash film also had to re-record several scenes to add, change or remove elements to make it more in line with the new DCU, which greatly increased its production costs and made it more likely to be a failure. Remember, the more a movie is invested in, the more is expected of it. On the other hand, DC fandom is extremely fragmented, as there is a good portion that wants the Snyderverse to return, while another group wants the new films to move as far away from it as possible. And well, here are a couple of truths that may not please either side. For one thing, a return to the Snyderverse is looking increasingly impossible. All the actors involved are already on other projects, and honestly, can you imagine Henry Cavill returning to DC after what Warner did to him? On the other hand, like or dislike Snyder's style, you have to accept that it's the only approach the DC universe has had on film that has felt truly different and separate from what Marvel does. Something that so far the last few films have not been able to do on film. And I think that has to do with why so many of us miss the Snyderverse so much, because they have yet to offer us something else that proposes a different alternative in the interconnected universe of DC. They've done it with the Batman, they've done it with Joker, but not in the interconnected universe itself. When you look at this whole picture, you realize that the Ezra Miller scandals, unfortunately, had nothing to do with the film's poor reception. In fact, this failure was not even because the film itself was bad. Rather, it was due to a set of factors such as the fact that the film looks too much like everything we have already seen, which made it unable to stand out in a highly competitive context where people are increasingly hesitant to go to the movies. It had the misfortune of having a very high production cost, the result of Warner Brothers' internal bureaucracy, and did not excite the fan base of this type of film because the film feels like a remnant of a universe that already was, something that is no longer valid. Warner Brothers, for their part, is taking matters into their own hands because they haven't had a big commercial success since The Batman. It was recently reported that Warner has just signed a contract with Synalytics, a company that uses artificial intelligence to predict audience consumption patterns, with which Warner intends to make its next decisions. That is, which projects it approves and which it does not. Wow, they applied the plot of the villain from Space Jam 2. Indeed, son, and we don't know if this new algorithm-driven Warner is going to go for established formulas, or be innovative, or even continue to greenlight superhero movies. At least not in a shared universe and with these big budgets.